Greetings from the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual book talk with Alex Tresniowski, author of The Rope. Before we begin, though, I'd like to tell you about two upcoming programs you can view on our YouTube channel. On Thursday, February 11th at 5 p.m., Paul and Stephen Kendrick will be here to tell us about their new book, 9 Days, which chronicles the arrest of Martin Luther King Jr. in Georgia, just weeks before the 1960 presidential election, and how the Kennedy and Nixon campaigns dealt with it. And on Tuesday, February 16th at noon, Robert Watson will be here to discuss his new book, George Washington's Final Battle, which describes Washington's active role in choosing the location of the new capital on the shores of the Potomac. In recounting the true crime story of the investigation into a 1910 murder of a child in Asbury Park, New Jersey, Alex Tresniowski also introduces the reader to the tireless work of anti-lynching crusader Ida B. Wells Barnett. She began her campaign in the early 1890s, writing articles, pamphlets, letters, and petitions to bring attention to this horrific practice and lobbying for its end. In the National Archives, her words are preserved in writings sent to Congress and the President, calling for anti-lynching laws in aid for the families of victims. At the end of the first decade of the 20th century, lynching was still a real threat for African Americans, especially those suspected of crimes like the accused man in the Asbury Park murder. But at the same time, Wells Barnett and other black leaders founded the NAACP to advance justice for African Americans. Today, Alex Tresniowski will share with us the parallel stories of a historical murder investigation and the activism of Ida B. Wells Barnett and the NAACP. Alex Tresniowski is the author or co-author of more than 20 books, including 6 New York Times bestsellers. His 2011 book, An Invisible Thread, spent more than 40 weeks on the Times bestseller list and won a prestigious Christopher Award for works that affirm the highest values of the human spirit. In 2005, Alex co-authored The Vendetta, the story of the FBI Special Agent Melvin Purvis, the G-Man who caught John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Babyface Nelson. One of his most recent books, 2017's The Founding, is the basis of a CNN Films documentary called The Lost Sons, which is currently in production. Now let's hear from Alex Tresniowski. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. This is Alex. Thank you, sir, for hosting me today. I appreciate that. My name is Alex Tresniowski, and I'm the author of The Rope. And I'm very pleased to be able to share a couple stories from it with you today. It's a book that I really care about, and a book that, while I was working on it, became even more relevant than when I started. Just to fill you in on what it is a little bit, it takes place in Asbury Park, New Jersey in 1910. And Asbury Park was a little resort town built from scrubgrass as a haven for very godly white people, essentially, where they could go and engage in pure activities and, things like even kissing on the boardwalk weren't allowed, certainly no liquor or anything like that. And as the turn of the century rolled by, Asbury Park began to get more attractions, more people, more hotels. And then, of course, the idea of this pure city, this angelic, godly city, sort of started to fall apart because human nature is what it is, and everybody gathered there, and things happened that were beyond the control of James Bradley, who was the founder of the town. So the story starts with a murder. It's the murder of a young child, a young girl named Marie Smith. She got up 8 o'clock one morning and went to school with her younger brother. Got to school and was supposed to come home at 12:30 for lunch and never made it home. And that resulted in a 5-day manhunt with hundreds and hundreds of people scouring every square inch of Asbury Park for any sign of her, and nothing turned up until 5 days later. In the dark woods, somebody did find a body, and this was Marie Smith's body. She had been beaten, she'd been abused, and was just left there, a florist from a local town founder. And of course, that sets off, a murder investigation that is sort of the propellant of this book. Right after the murder, the first thing that happened was that a black handyman named Tom Williams, he was an ex-boxer who fought under the name Black Diamond, was rounded up. And he had painted a house near where the girl lived, and he sort of vaguely knew the parents. And very quickly, they were able to put him in jail and sort of set him up as the likely killer of Marie Smith, without any really process or anything. In fact, his second day in jail, a white mob stormed the jail and did their best to break him out and lynch him, and he narrowly escaped that by car with the help of a sergeant at the station. So Tom Williams was in a position that a lot of Black Americans found themselves in back at the turn of the century, and that sort of becomes the backdrop of my story, which is lynching. It was a scourge in the country. A 5-year study published in 2015 by the Equal Justice Initiative found that almost 4,000 Black women, men, and children were lynched in the 12 southern states in just 70 years. And the thing with lynching was we were in a part of our history where the Civil War was over and Black people were trying to integrate into society. And what happened was every step of progress that they made was met by resistance. People who wanted the old order. And one of the tools that they used was lynching, extrajudicial killing. They would find Black people who were prominent and basically eliminate them and destroy them. And under the pretense of what was believed to be they are savages and they can only be dealt with this way, when in fact the real reason behind a lot of the lynchings was economic suppression. But that wasn't really accepted in the country at that time. So lynchings were perfectly acceptable in a way. They were never prosecuted. I mean, they might have an inquest, but usually the decision would be that the Black person was killed by persons unknown. Even though most people in white mobs were known to everyone, they were fathers, judges, lawyers, barbers, people from the town. But it was seen as a way of policing society. So it was okay that they didn't get their due process because this was just the way it was handled at the turn of the century. And that's one of the parts of our history that we've never really confronted fully. I found as I did this book that there's a lot of parts of our history that we've never really sat down and looked at in a sufficient way so that we all agree on what happened. For instance, even the Civil War, there's not really an agreement on what really caused the war, not a national agreement. So there's issues in our history that sort of haunt us, and lynching is one of them. As I was working on this book, George Floyd was killed by a police officer, and we all saw that, and that led to outrage and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I was reminded how relevant this story is that I'm working on. It's not old history. It's current history. The events of 110 years ago are the same as the events now. Extrajudicial killings, Black rights, the search for justice, giving voice to the voiceless. And that's what I was writing about back then. And it sort of came to life in a way where it just made it more imminent and urgent that we remember our past so that we can deal with the present and the future. And, hopefully this book plays a tiny part in that dialogue. But getting back to the story, now that we have Tom Williams in trouble and in a real threat of being lynched for a murder, which he may or may not have committed, a second story comes into play. And this involves Ida B. Wells, and she is a well-known journalist, activist, public speaker, and at one point the most famous Black woman in the world, basically. And her story appealed to me because the Tom Williams case was the third legal case ever handled by the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That was a brand new organization started in 1909 that was still trying to get its footing at the time that the murder happened in Asbury Park, and this became their third legal case ever. And I wanted to sort of see how that happened and how the NAACP played a part in this case, while at the same time looking at the case and the incredible efforts that were made to solve the case. That's a whole nother story. So, but on the Ida Wells side, I really wanted to sort of look at her life and take 5 or 6 moments and events from her life that led her to become who she became, which is a pioneer and crusader against lynching, for civil rights, for black rights, and possibly the most courageous woman I've ever read about or written about. She was a solitary force at her time. She fell into situations and rose to them. She didn't want to be a public speaker. She became a public speaker. You know, she didn't necessarily want to be an outspoken journalist, but she became one because she was forced to. She didn't always want to leave her home and 4 children to go out and defend somebody who was under the threat of lynching, but she did, and often saved them and made a huge difference on a granular level, but also in a way that moved history. And then she is one of the founders of the NAACP. So I really wanted to chart how she got there and then how the NAACP was able to step in the Tom Williams case. So I'll go back to the detective story in a bit. It's really a detective story and then the story of the NAACP and how they converged in 1910. But I also wanted to just tell one little story now about Ida B. Wells from the book that I thought really showed how individuals are moved and into action, and how you face a moment where you have to make a decision of what kind of America you want to live in and what role you want to play in that America. And Ida Wells faced such a moment in her life at the age of 30. By then, she'd been born into slavery. She'd been born during the Civil War. Her parents died when she was very young from yellow fever. She had to stay with her young family and siblings to keep them together. She'd had a very hard life. She took a job as a teacher and had to ride on a mule for several miles back and forth. She'd been kicked off trains and stood up to the train companies. She'd had her share of activism that just came naturally to her, and defiance. But at 30, she was a journalist. She was working and writing about the black issues of the day, but under a pen name and not quite as forcefully as history would require her to do at some point. So then an event happened, and that's the event I'd like to tell you a little bit about. So Ida Wells at that time had an office where she worked at the Free Speech newspaper in Memphis, Tennessee, in a neighborhood called The Curve, which was named after a railroad track that sort of bent through the town. It was a mixed neighborhood, whites, blacks, and the mail carrier in that neighborhood was a man named Thomas Moss. Young man, ambitious guy. He knew everybody in town because he was a mail carrier, and he also knew all the good gossip in town. So when he would stop by the offices of the Free Speech, the newspaper on Beale Street, he would spend time with Ida, and they became really good friends. And Ida even became a godmother to his young daughter, Maureen, who was 1 year old. And they became just friendly. And Ida called him a finer, cleaner man, never walked the streets of Memphis. She was incredibly impressed by him because he was future-oriented. He got together with 10 other prominent African Americans, and they started something called the People's Grocery. And this was a collective owned by 11 black people, which became a very competitive grocery in the Curve. They actually presented a pretty strong competition to a grocery store nearby that was white-owned, which was called Barrett's Grocery, and it was owned by William Russell Barrett, a white man in town. So this was an example of black progress, of a black initiative in a rough neighborhood, but a progressing neighborhood. And Thomas Moss was right at the heart of that. He was, trying to make a better life for himself, for his family, for his wife Patty, for his daughter, and for every other black in the Curve. And Ida Wells was a part of that. She was part of that group. And then came a terrible event. It began with two children playing marbles on a front lawn. And a fight happened, and an argument happened, and then a scrabble happened, and suddenly the kids were fighting. Suddenly adults joined in. The adults took sides, the parents took sides, and before long there was a full-blown melee in the town, whites against blacks. And it went on for more than a day. It lingered for days. After the fight itself, and there were some injuries during the fight, one of the people injured was Barrett, the grocery store owner, who said he was clubbed in the head by one of the black workers at the People's Grocery, a man named Will Stewart. So we have an angry grocery store owner who wants to prosecute Will Stewart. We have black people in town who are hearing rumors of white mobs coming to get them and arrest them. And in fact, 100 white citizens do get deputized overnight and armed and do confront the workers at the People's Grocery. And there's a shootout there. And some officers are injured. And that results in the arrests of 3 people, including Tommy Moss and Will Stewart and one other man. They are arrested and taken to a jail. And Patty immediately tried, Thomas's wife, to bring some food over. They told her to go away. It's too dangerous. Come back in a couple of days. The white mob is just constantly gathered around the prison, comes and goes, but it's a very sort of fluid, active event that these people are in jail now, and it's sort of a great fear for everybody in the town. And of course, Ida knows about this and is hoping it comes out okay. So what happens is, at 2 a.m. one morning, 75 men in black masks surrounded the jail. They broke out Tommy Moss and Will Stewart and the third man. They dragged them about a mile to an empty railroad yard, and then they shot them. The newspapers called it a wholesale lynching, the curse of the Southland. The next day, white looters went into the People's Grocery and stripped the shelves of all the food. What remained of the inventory, which was very little, was sold to William Russell Barrett for 18 cents on the dollar. And so Thomas Moss was gone, the People's Grocery was gone in an instant, in a couple of days. And there was nothing anybody can do about it. There was an inquest, and it was found to be persons unknown who committed this extrajudicial killing. And that's just the way things went there. So when Ida found that out, she was crushed. She decided she had to leave the South, leave Memphis, her homeland. She was born in Mississippi, and find another place to live, and urged other blacks to leave Memphis as well so they could find a place where they could find peace and justice, and they decided it couldn't be in the South. And that's how hostile they found it there. And then she had to make another decision, because as soon as she left, the offices of the free speech were burned down. She was threatened with lynching should she ever come back and set foot in Memphis. She had to buy a gun for the first time to protect herself. And she left for Brooklyn. And there she got another job as a newspaper writer, but had to decide what kind of writer, what kind of reaction she would have to this existential threat of lynching in America. And she chose to become a full-blown activist and really make a difference. And so between 1892 and 1895, just 1 year after the killing of Tommy Moss, she put all her efforts into producing 2 incredible pamphlets, Southern Horrors and A Red Record, which were meticulously recorded recordings of all the lynchings in the South at the time, including the grisly details of the lynchings and the reasons for the lynchings. And through that reportage, this incredible reportage, this weight of her reportage, she was able to prove in her way that these people were not lynched because they were savages who attacked white women or whistled at white women or any other offense like that. most of the time it was economic suppression. It was a way to eliminate competition, like a grocery store, or clear out of town, or whatever it might be. The motives behind the lynchings were much more complicated, much more devious than just simply reacting to some kind of crime. And of course, that caused an outrage. That was not what was accepted to be true about lynching at the time. But Ida had chosen her path, and she was on her way, and she went around and started giving speeches about lynching. And one of her first speeches at the Lyric Hall in 42nd Street in New York City, the heart of New York City, she talked about Thomas Moss. And it was obvious that she was doing something else. She was not only talking about lynching, but she was humanizing the people who were gone. She was giving them a humanity that had never been given. She was giving them a name, a voice, describing what they did, describing their families, and standing up for them and saying they lived and they mattered and they shouldn't be forgotten and there should be justice for them. And in her first speech, which she didn't want to give but gave anyway, through tears, she remembered Thomas Moss, and she recounted the story of going to the widow's house, Betty Moss, and seeing two young children, Maureen and then also Thomas Moss Jr., who had been born just a few weeks after his father was killed. And Ida wrote about seeing the young daughter go over to the closet. She wrote, "The baby daughter of Tom Moss, too young to express how she misses her father, toddlers over to the wardrobe, seizes the legs of her father's letter carrier uniform, and hugs and kisses them with evident delight. And then she stretches up her little hands to be taken up in the arms that will never more clasp her." This was the kind of story that had never been told about lynching victims. The crowd at Lyric Hall was in tears. It was one of the most powerful speeches ever given at the time about lynching. And it sort of set Ida on the course that would lead her to be instrumental in the founding of the NAACP. At the end of the speech, she said, "Do we ask for a remedy for lynching?" Well, she had one. She said, "A public sentiment strong against lawlessness must be aroused. Every individual can contribute to this awakening. When a sentiment against lynch law, strong, deep, and mighty as that against slavery, prevails, I have no fear of the result. The voice of the people is the voice of God." And in this story, which is one of a few about Ida, I'm just hoping to convey how individuals like Ida made decisions, faced crossroads that ended up playing a huge part in history, and always with the motivation of giving voice to the voiceless. This is a theme that recurs in the story. And of course, the other line of the story is this incredible detective thriller where a detective from New York, Raymond Schindler, is hired to come in and find the actual killer of Marie Smith. And I've given short shrift to that side of the story today, but it's a very exciting resolution to that case, because this is it's his first murder case. He's a very young detective. He doesn't have any set ways, so he sets an enormous psychological trap for his main suspect in New York City and pursues him for months and uses an infiltrator called the Rope to sort of rope him in and gain his confidence and gain a confession. And it's sort of incredible how that case plays out. And then in 1911, the two cases sort of converge because the NCAA gets involved with the Tom Williams case as its third case ever handled. So in this short time, I just hope to convey that The Rope is about individual courage, granular courage, how it takes individual quiet heroism from people at certain moments in life to advance a cause. You know, Ida Wells was pushing a big cause, but with the other hand, she was helping people. She was putting people on trains to avoid lynchings. She was raising $50 to set up a reward. Whatever it might be, individual heroism, quiet heroism, conviction, perseverance. This is what shined through in her story and the story of Raymond Schindler. And it's sort of what I hope comes through today if you read it, and why it's relevant today, because I think we all face that choice. We haven't decided yet what America this is and what America we all want to live in. As a country, that's not been decided. I mean, certainly now more than ever, it's not decided. It's something that has to be confronted every day. Who do we want to be as Americans? Who do we want to help? What matters to us? What are our values? What is America? And I had to answer that question in the heat of battle. So did Raymond Schindler. And what happened with them and the resolution of the murder case, I hope is a kind of a thrilling story that also has historical relevance and resonance. And I appreciate you just let me tell you this one little story from it. And I really hope you enjoy it. So thank you so much for listening. I should also tell you that, just another fact, I used to be the true crime writer at People magazine for a long time. And I've always had a fascination with true crime stories, and I found that a lot of other people do as well. In fact, those were always the most popular stories at People magazine, no matter what. You know, we had human interest stories, celebrities. It was the true crime that sort of compelled readers to sink in, and I think we all sort of have that, or at least a lot of us do, where we are drawn to the dark side of nature and want to see from a distance what it's like to, to live in that world. And these are people in the rope that do live in that world, certainly the detective. And that's one of the reasons I was drawn to the book, because it just seemed to me to be, a thrilling story. And that's always what I'm looking for. Yes, was the murder ever solved? It was solved. I don't want to give away too much of the book, but it is solved by the end of the book by Raymond Schindler in an unusual way, and it's fully adjudicated, and we take you through the full resolution of that. And today, Marie Smith is buried in a big cemetery in Brooklyn, which I visited and found her plot, which was bare. And I went back and put a little plaque there to honor her and sort of remember her, so that she had a little place in the world still. And that's another reason why I wanted to do this story, to sort of give Marie Smith a moment. Today in Asbury Park, this crime is not really commemorated in any way. I went there. It's a ghost of its own self, Asbury Park. Some of the houses that people lived in, like Marie's house, is still there. The path she walked to school is still there. But the place where she was killed is not. And most of the city is different from what it was. And there's really no commemoration of it other than in historical societies and newspaper accounts. Certainly no plaque or anything like that. Like I said, that's why I felt like I wanted to put a physical thing at her gravesite to sort of commemorate her. It's kind of a forgotten case, hopefully until now. There are some surviving relatives. In terms of getting a proper headstone for Marie, I will tell you it's a bureaucratic nightmare. If you're not related to her, it's almost impossible. The family fell out of paying for the plot, so there's some back monies owed in terms of keeping up the maintenance of the plot, of everything else, and I'm trying to get in touch with some surviving family members to see if that's something we could do. I think it would be a beautiful thing and mark it with a ceremony. And certainly I'll update readers on my website, alextres.com, if that ever happens. But it's quite not as easy as it looks, certainly if you're not a family member. But I think it's a great idea. I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to talk about this story. I think it's a great story and meaningful. So, and I want to thank the organization for hosting this in this virtual time. Let's all kick in, be Americans, and pretty soon we'll be out there again, having fun, enjoying each other. So, thanks again. I really appreciate it.